thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming. This is really very exciting. I want to talk to you about what I think is the most important challenge facing Sri Lanka today, which is how do you resume inclusive economic growth. But just to recap, to make sure we're on the same wavelength, just as you probably all know, Sri Lanka suffered the worst economic crisis since independence in 2022, just 2 years ago, where GDP growth fell by 7.5%. In addition, in that same year, inflation hit an unprecedented 70%. And in addition, there were these shortages because they ran out of reserves, the shortages of fuel and medicine and food and things like that. Now, the point is, I think we all have a sense of what are the proximate causes of this crisis. We know that in 2019, the government cut taxes radically. The tax to GDP ratio fell to about 8% of GDP, which is the second lowest in the world, next to Somalia. The fiscal deficit ballooned to 13% of GDP. And in April 2020, so before COVID and everything else, the credit rating agencies downgraded Sri Lanka to near default levels on its sovereign bonds. But the government, instead of embarking on a restructuring, continued to pay the bondholders in full. And not surprisingly, because they were paying it out of reserves, they ran out of reserves. And that's what led to the crisis and the default. In addition, that fiscal deficit, that 13% of GDP, since they couldn't borrow abroad, the fiscal deficit was financed by borrowing from the central bank. Now, we know the textbooks all tell us that that's going to generate inflation. That's printing money to finance a fiscal deficit. And sure enough, inflation reached 70% in 2022, just as the textbooks would predict. Now, I think this narrative, and I can see people are nodding their heads, is sort of well established. But I want to say I'm not satisfied with this. And I'll tell you why. Because if you take the long view, Sri Lanka is one of the most successful economies in South Asia. Its per capita GDP is higher than every sizable South Asian economy. I mean, it's lower than Maldives and those boutiques. So it has performed really well, basically since 1948. Secondly, the human development indicators are the envy of the whole world. Sri Lanka's child mortality rate is the same as that of the United States. At about 1/50th of the per capita income. And secondary school enrollment rates are practically 100% and way higher than the South Asian peers. And the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that Sri Lanka has been an uninterrupted democracy since independence and scores higher than the world average for some years, and certainly higher than the Asian average on various democracy indicators. So the reason I'm uncomfortable with that original set of causes of the crisis is, how can a country that was doing so well end up in this kind of crisis? How could they have screwed up so badly? Conversely, you can say, if they really genuinely messed up, how did they get away with all of this past growth and human development that has done so well? And the most important question, which I hope we'll discuss today, is, regardless of what the causes were, how can we fix it? How can we get growth going? Which I think is the biggest challenge facing the country today. Now, I want to suggest that the answer to all three of those questions, how do they do so well when they did so badly in 2022? Or conversely, if they had done so well, why did they mess up so badly in 2022? And how do you get growth going, especially inclusive growth going? The answer to all three of those questions is the same. It's one word, and the word is accountability. And let me first define what I mean by accountability, because there are different interpretations of it. And I would say there are two types of accountability that I'll be talking about. One is accountability to markets. If you're a firm and you're in a competitive market, and that's an important qualification, then you're accountable to the market. If you don't produce, if you're not cost competitive, the market will punish you. And if you do produce and you are cost competitive, the market will reward you. So it's a built-in accountability mechanism that the market has. And competitive markets are neutral. They don't care who you are. They just care about whether you're making profit or not. Now, not everything has a market. So for various reasons, governments intervene in the economy because either there's no market or the market has failed, there are market failures, imperfections, and so on. But then, and that's a perfectly legitimate role for government, is to intervene to correct market failures. The question then is, who is holding the government accountable? When the government intervenes, and it intervenes saying, we want to intervene in education because we want to make sure that poor people are able to get an education and use that to escape poverty, say, for instance, who is making sure that the government actually delivers? And that's where you come in, the citizens. So the government, when it intervenes, should be held accountable by citizens, because they are acting in the interests of citizens, and the citizens are the people who can hold government accountable. Now, as I'll try to show you, both of these types of accountability have been missing in Sri Lanka sometimes for the last 70 years. And that actually has a corrosive effect on the economy, not to mention society, and that has actually contributed to the crisis. And put it positively, to resume growth, we need to reintroduce accountability. When markets are functioning, accountability to the market, and when government is intervening, accountability by citizens of government. Now, let me start, though, with a case where this actually worked in Sri Lanka. When they moved to accountability of markets, the place did extraordinarily well. And that is in international trade. As some of you may remember, in the late 1970s, Sri Lanka liberalized its trade regime, the J.R. Jayawardena government. And the place just boomed. The trade liberalization, as I said, was the late 70s, 78, 79, and you can see that the growth rate just took off. This is a log chart, so the people who remember their mathematics will know that if you have a log chart, the slope is the growth rate. So you can just look at the slope, and that tells you what the growth rate is. And you can see that the slope has gotten steeper after 79, and has stayed steep for a long time. And this is not an accident, because when they introduced trade liberalization, or they were talking about trade liberalization in the late 70s, there was a lot of opposition, as you may know, including by, for instance, the garment sector. There was a small domestic garment sector that would produce, frankly, low-quality shirts and things for the domestic market. And they were up in arms, saying, well, if you bring in these cheap imports, we're going to lose the garment industry. But in fact, the opposite happened. the garment industry boomed thanks to cheap imports and foreign investment. Because the foreign investors, when they knew that Sri Lanka was genuinely going to liberalize trade, that it was not going to be arbitrary about trade policy, it had committed to free trade, they moved in. Sri Lanka's garment exports actually exceeded those of Bangladesh, China, Pakistan, all of these others on a per capita basis. And unemployment fell. Unemployment went from 15% to under 4%. So this trade liberalization was one of the most pro-poor policies that Sri Lanka ever undertook. And it's the fact that they showed that you can do it makes you think we could possibly do it again. Because in fact, what's going on today is that this is going in the opposite direction. In fact, trade protection has increased. The trade ratio, which is export plus imports divided by GDP, has been declining in the recent past. Even though it reached heights of 80% before, now it's down to about 35 or 40%, right? And we know how that's happened. There's been a series of policies, series of protectionist policies, blocking imports to favor certain domestic industries, exactly the thing that the earlier trade liberalization was trying to get rid of, and frankly, increasing corruption. I mean, it's not a coincidence. The IMF's governance diagnostic signals out the two most corrupt agencies in the Sri Lankan government was the Internal Revenue Department and the Customs Department. Right? It tells you that the possibility of rent-seeking that is being created by all of this protectionism. And of course, not coincidentally, the GDP growth rate has also declined since this protection has come forward. So my first policy recommendation is we should liberalize trade. This has got to be priority number one. And I don't say this in a facile fashion. I'm saying it because we have already done it once and shown that it works. If we've done it before and it has paid off, it doesn't always pay off in all countries. So this is a case where a country has shown that they can do it. And Sri Lankan entrepreneurs, when they are held accountable to world markets, actually deliver. They can deliver. So we can reverse that trend of the trade ratios by lowering import barriers, if not eliminating them. Okay, let me then turn to the second topic, which is agriculture. Now, agriculture is a lagging sector in Sri Lanka. It contributes the least to GDP, and agricultural productivity has hardly been growing. Now, notice a couple of things about agriculture in Sri Lanka. First, the overwhelming share of households, farm households, produce paddy. Right? It's almost 50%. Now, paddy happens to be the least productive crop of all the possible crops. That gives you the distribution of productivity, and the one to the left, the density function to the left, is that of paddy. All the other crops are more productive than paddy. Furthermore, paddy is the least lucrative crop in terms of rupees of output per acre, or gross value of output per acre in rupees. Paddy is the lowest, or one of the lowest. Paddy and cereals are about the same. But all of these other crops are much more valuable, much more profitable for the farmers. So you wonder, these farmers, 50% are growing paddy, and they're poor. They're staying poor because of the fact that paddy is not a lucrative enterprise. Now, why do they continue to do this? It turns out there's this thing called the Paddy Lands Act of 1958, before most of you were born. The Paddy Lands Act that requires farmers to grow paddy, farmers who lease land. They're obligated to grow paddy, and a whole bunch of other policies that are only geared towards farmers who grow paddy. And indeed, this constraint is still binding. I remember reading in a newspaper when I was here once, in the newspaper, that a farmer was fined 75,000 rupees for growing bananas in his land. Now think about that, right? That means that the farmer was willing to take the risk, because bananas are so much more profitable than paddy, that he may have to pay a fine, but it's still worth it. Now, so this just has to stop. We can't go on keeping these farmers poor, forcing them to grow paddy so they'll stay poor. It's just unacceptable. If we want the economy to grow, we want these poor farmers to actually earn a higher income, and they can. So the policy recommendation is to make those farmers accountable to markets, not to the government. Right now, all of these policies make the farmer have to do what the government tells him to do, and they fine him if he doesn't do it. Right? Instead, let them compete in markets and let them grow whatever they want. Now, I've tried this on various political leaders. I don't think any are in the room, but and the objection I receive is, oh, Shanta, don't go there. The Paddy Lands Act is all about land rights, and that's a controversial issue. We don't want to open up that Pandora's box. And I mean, I don't know enough to judge whether that's an excuse or a real reason. But anyway, and they're the political leaders, so I have to accept it. So my suggestion is, let's experiment. Let's take a couple of districts. Let's randomly choose some districts and let the farmers in those districts grow whatever they like. The Paddy Lands Act does not apply in that district. That's it, on a temporary basis. And then 2 years later, let's evaluate it. Let's look at the performance of those farmers, or those districts, and with comparable districts where the Paddy Lands Act still applies, and then see what difference it makes. Okay, now let me turn to the third area, which is I read about in the newspaper almost every day when I'm here. I've only been here 10 days, and every day there's an article about fuel subsidies or electricity subsidies. And, Sri Lanka has, for too long, had fuel and electricity subsidies. I mean, in 2022, the sum total of the losses of the Ceylon Electricity Board and the CPC, the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, was 3.1% of GDP. Right? That's the subsidy. Think about that, right? With a fiscal deficit was 13%, we could have been down to 10% without these subsidies. And not surprisingly, that's been part of the fiscal adjustment program, was to eliminate those subsidies. But I think subsidies are corrosive. They're much more corrosive than simply a drain on the budget. And the most important thing is the subsidies, the overwhelming majority of subsidies goes to the rich. They're the ones who drive gas-guzzling cars and have air conditioners and washing machines. So in Sri Lanka, it's been estimated that 70% of the subsidies go to the richest 30% of the population. Now, if this were a cash transfer program, and I told you, here we have a cash transfer program that gives 70% to the richest 30%, you'd say, get rid of it right now. Cancel it. But yet, not only do we have it, but I hear people advocating for more subsidies or bringing the subsidies back. So let's give the rich even more money. And by the way, that 70% figure that I gave you is not different from other developing countries. So here's a study by the IMF looking at a number of developing countries, and you find that the subsidy benefits, about 50% of subsidy benefits go to the richest quintile, the richest 20%. That's the average across all of these countries. And the amount that goes to the poorest quintile is that little turquoise sliver. It's like 5%. So what we're doing is embarking on a program to subsidize the rich. We have to get rid of it. We can't do it. And now let me then turn to the really corrosive aspects of subsidies, of fuel subsidies, is that comes back to this point about accountability. Because when we subsidize electricity, say the CEB, you break the accountability of the electric utility to the consumer. See, the electric utility is paid by the government. That's where the subsidy comes from. So they don't care what the consumer thinks. They have no incentive to actually deliver quality services to the consumer. And as you've probably noticed, they end up not delivering, or the services is very poor. It's even worse than that, because when you subsidize electricity, you create excess demand for electricity, and then every now and then there's a huge blackout, electricity shortages for various reasons, mostly because the utility has not invested in maintenance of the electricity grid. And then especially if it's an election year, they panic. And then they go out and buy these diesel generators, which are very costly and polluting, and use them to fill the demand in the short run. But the short run never goes away. So now we're stuck with all of these diesel generators providing high-cost electricity. So Sri Lanka has one of the highest costs of electricity in South Asia. Paradoxically, by eliminating the subsidy and raising the price of electricity, you might be able to help the poor more, because then at least they'll get some electricity. But there's another way in which these subsidies are really perverse. Now think about the fuel subsidy. The fuel subsidy, and when you talk to politicians or government officials or even civil society, they tell you, oh, well, the purpose of the subsidy is to help the poor, right? Well, think about what that says. It tells a poor person, if you want to get a benefit from the state, you have to consume fuel. Now compare that to a cash transfer, a targeted cash transfer to the poor. If you give them a check or give them cash, they can spend it on whatever they like. They don't have to spend it on fuel, because they don't spend much on fuel anyway. They can use it to educate their kids or improve their house or invest in their business. So it's actually shifting the accountability from the citizen to the government. Then the citizen actually can decide how to spend the benefit from the state, rather than the state deciding for the citizen how they should spend it. So these subsidies are really perverse in their effect on inclusive growth. So my third proposal is eliminate the subsidies and replace them with targeted cash transfers. Because it is true that poor people will have to pay higher prices now for that electricity. Now, that leads us to the next problem, which is cash transfers. Because Sri Lanka has a cash transfer program called Samurdhi, which is it's the largest cash transfer program, 1% of GDP. It's been going on for about 20, 25 years. The trouble is, it's not clear it's reaching the poor. So here was a study done several years ago now that looked at the incidence of Samurdhi transfers. And what they found was that only 30%, this is at a time when the poverty rate was about 20%. So you could think of the bottom quintile as the poor. Only 30% of Samurdhi transfers went to the poor. And of the poor, only 63% of them received Samurdhi transfers. I mean, about 37% of them didn't even get the Samurdhi transfers. But the rest of it went to the rich. Now, how is that? What's going on here? This is supposed to be a targeted cash transfer program. Well, now there have been some studies done looking at who received the Samurdhi transfers. So there's this very nice dissertation from the LSE. Ifat Sharif looked at the percentage of households receiving Samurdhi transfers. In this case, at that time, they were food stamps. And the percentage of people in that district who voted for the People's Alliance, which was the party in power at that time. And you found that if they voted between 40 and 60%, they got Samurdhi transfers. If they had voted less than 40% or above 60%, they didn't bother. Because either you're going to lose that district anyway, or you already got them in the bag, so why bother with them? So it's the marginal vote that you want to curry favor with Samurdhi transfers. And this is not just I'm not just playing with numbers. There's evidence. So there was the survey done, and it said they interviewed people, and they said political affiliation determined the eligibility of some to receive the consumption grant. This problem was confirmed by several Samurdhi managers and Niyamakas. The Niyamakas said that they are under pressure from area politicians and village-level party organizations to give the Samurdhi grant to PA families, People's Alliance families, and to deny them to UNP supporters. Not because they're poor, but because they were UNP supporters. Now, you might say this is 15 years ago, whenever the last time the PA was in power. I should be careful in the Bandaranaike Academy. But it turns out this problem hasn't gone away. So today, Samurdhi today is just as badly targeted. It only reaches 40% of the poor. Less than half of the poor in Sri Lanka are receiving Samurdhi transfers. And just in the last 9 months, I've observed, when they moved to Aswasuma, they tried to develop a tightly organized targeting system and eliminated certain people who were not qualified and introduced Aswasuma, which was passed by Parliament, I should add. But then the people who were thrown off the rolls started protesting. And then members of a certain party immediately joined the protest and asked that they be put back on the rolls. Clear evidence that this was still being used for political patronage rather than poverty alleviation. And I thought maybe we've overcome that, but just literally 2 weeks ago, I read a story in the newspaper. I can't always believe what you read in the newspaper, that they were holding a rally in the south somewhere, and they were having trouble getting people to come to the rally. So they threatened them. They told them, if you don't come, you're going to lose your Aswasuma benefits. Think about that. In a campaign, during an electoral campaign, they're signaling this. This means when they get elected, you know what they're going to do, right? So this has to stop. And there are ways to do it. So my colleagues at Verité have proposed a simple, transparent method of targeting. No complicated formula, and it's just simply based on your electricity bill. If you consume less than 60 kilowatt hours a month, you get the Samurdhi transfer. If you consume more than that, you don't. And what they can show is that if you do it that way, you can reach 81% of the poor, as opposed to less than 50%, and reduce the amount of leakage to the non-poor. So it's not perfect, and there are lots of things you can argue about. People say, oh, well, then they'll just have 2 houses or something, all sorts of ways to manipulate that system. But nevertheless, it's an improvement over the current system, and it's harder to manipulate. So my fourth recommendation is replace Aswasuma with a simple criterion that's transparent, that everybody can see, that can actually target the poor. And if you have a well-functioning targeted cash transfer, that enables you to do much more work on removing subsidies. Because you can't just remove subsidies and hope that the cash transfers will reach the poor. Okay, now fifth, I think fifth, right? Yeah, is education. Now, again, as we said earlier, Sri Lanka's education system is the envy of the world. Everyone looks at this graph and says, oh, I wish we were Sri Lanka. The high secondary school enrollment rates, some of the highest in the world, in the developing world, are here. And it's practically 100%. So these kids are going to school for 10, 11 years in secondary school. The problem is whether they're learning anything, right? And the trouble is, in particular, there's a problem with the provincial schools. This is what happens whenever you have a free public education system. There's good results in the elite neighborhoods of Colombo, like Colombo 7. So the national schools have a pretty high rate of qualification to A levels. average of about 75%. But look at the provincial schools. None of them reaches 50%. So half the kids don't progress to A levels. Now, what's going on here? Because these kids have been going to school for 10, 11 years. Well, the problem is, about 15% of the time, the teacher is not there. And you can see that the teacher absentee rates are higher in the remote provinces. Now you can see, if the teacher's not there, they're not likely to learn anything. They're not likely to pass their exams. Now, why is the teacher not there? Well, the teacher is not accountable. The teacher is accountable to the government, not to the student or the parents of the student. And the government can't monitor the teachers. And we've observed this in other countries as well, that teachers then do other things. They don't show up for work because they can earn money doing other things. And in many ways, the politicians might even encourage them to do that because teachers also help run the political campaigns. So the teacher's happy, the politician is happy. Unfortunately, the children are the losers. So the simple proposition, it actually is worse than that, because in Sri Lanka you have this other feature of private tutoring, which is widespread. Now, it covers, in 2006, the survey showed that it was about 64% of the households showed positive private tuition expenditures. So this is the private sector. The so-called free education system is parallel with a private tutoring system, sometimes with the same teacher, right? But the really distressing part is that this is also happening among the poor. So the poorest quartile here, in the poorest quartile, 60% declared positive private tuition expenditures. Now think about that. We design a public education system so the poor are the ones who can benefit from it, the free public education system. And if they have to pay so that their kids get an education, because the education they're getting in the public sector, public school, is not sufficient, this is unacceptable. And there are ways to fix this. This is not rocket science. I've been working on this for 25 years now. But you can introduce, all you need to do is to make the teacher and the school accountable for learning outcomes. And there are different ways to do that. One is vouchers. In Bogota, Colombia, they introduced a system of vouchers for poor people so that the children can choose which school to go to. And whichever school they go to gets paid. And so then you find that the schools are actually trying to attract students and improving the quality of their teaching and the teachers showing up and things like that. You can also introduce contract teachers, as they've done in Kenya. But I think the most powerful method I've seen is transparency. It's making this information available to the public so they can bring pressure to bear on the system. This is very important because, I mean, I'm always getting criticism, I probably will today too, because people say, you know, how can you be criticizing the sacred, free public education system that has delivered so well for all of us? And we'll see, these are people who tell me, you know, I benefited from the free education system. Well, these are mostly privileged people. These are like my relatives, right? They're not the ones this free public education system was meant for. They're meant for the poor. And if we're not delivering for the poor, we've got a problem. So I think you can have some education reform. Let me skip the next point, because it's we're running out of time. And let me turn to the last one, which is macroeconomic policy, which in many ways I started out with, as that's what got us into this mess in the first place. But you think about it from the point of view of how to finance a given fiscal deficit. You really have three choices. This is, again, the textbook description. You can borrow abroad, and if you borrow in international capital markets, you're held accountable. Because if you are profligate with the money you borrow, they'll punish you, as they did to Sri Lanka, by downgrading their credit rating. You can borrow in domestic private capital markets, but there the interest rate goes up when you do, and they will punish you. Or there's political pressure. Or you can borrow from the central bank. And no one is holding you accountable. You can say, well, if you do that too much, eventually there'll be high inflation, which is true. But that's so far away, because that happens with a lag, that you can always blame it on Ukraine wars and COVID, all sorts of other reasons, as they did. Then the fact that you chose to print money to finance the fiscal deficit. And we know what happened. Inflation hit 70%. So this is one thing that we've actually been able to do something about in the last year, which is the central bank bill. The central bank bill actually says the governor of the central bank cannot finance the fiscal deficit directly. He's forbidden to. Which means that the Minister of Finance or the Secretary of Treasury can't put pressure on the governor of the central bank, as has been done in the past. You're tying the governor's hands so that he can credibly say, sorry, I can't help you. There's a Central Bank Act that prevents me from doing this. Because that's the only way we can bring in some accountability to that form of financing. Now, finally, let me say something about another aspect which has become somewhat controversial around here, which is the composition of foreign borrowing between official creditors and private creditors. As you can see, the composition has shifted in the last 10 years in favor of international sovereign bonds. There are almost none in 2005 or so, and now they're about a third of the borrowing, of the debt. Okay? And this is deemed a bad thing. As I said, there's a quote from Bram Nicholas and Sharon Ilan Perumal. Sri Lanka's default highlights the dangers of relying on international sovereign bonds to fund development. But I want to suggest it's the opposite. This is the best thing, because those international sovereign bonds will hold the government accountable. If the government can't mess around with the money that they borrow from the sovereign bondholders, because they'll punish you right away. And we saw that in Sri Lanka when the fiscal deficit went through the roof. they downgraded Sri Lanka in August 20, this one, the Fitch downgraded it to near default level. Actually, they downgraded to B- earlier than that, which meant that the interest rates were exorbitant and effectively they couldn't borrow and they couldn't refinance in the national capital markets. So if you think there's a slight chance that the government might misuse those funds, and I'm just speculating, the best thing to do is to make sure that they only borrow from sovereign bondholders. Because the official creditors are playing geopolitics, right? So they borrow or they lend, and Sri Lanka borrows for geopolitical reasons, which have nothing to do with the productivity of those investments. And this came to me because in 2020, 2020, Sri Lanka turned down a $500 million grant from the US Millennium Challenge Corporation and a $1.5 billion loan at 0.1% interest from the Japanese. They refused both of those and took on high interest loans from the Chinese. Right. Why? Well, there are all these issues with the UN Human Rights Commission where they thought that the US and Japan were putting pressure on Sri Lanka on human rights, and the Chinese don't bother about human rights, don't bother you about human rights, they don't even bother their own people. And so it was easy, it was for geopolitical reasons, it was easier to borrow from the government. So, but I think it was a big mistake. So what I would propose is that we have a separation between foreign investment and foreign policy. You have a firewall. You make foreign investment decisions just on the productivity of the investment. You don't care who it's from. And you make foreign policy decisions for whatever foreign policy reasons. Now, you might think that that's pie in the sky, I'm dreaming. Right? But I'll give you an example. China and Taiwan. China and Taiwan are sworn enemies. They don't even recognize each other. And yet, China is Taiwan's largest trading partner and largest investment destination. They don't care. If it's a productive investment, they'll do it, even if it's with a country that you're essentially in a Cold War with. So I think we can do it, but we need to have that separation. Okay, so let me conclude before Nishan gets too excited. So let me just summarize what I've said so far, because we promised in the title Policies for Inclusive Growth or something like that. First, liberalize trade. And the reason I'm saying that is because we've done it before and it has worked. So we have a track record. Allow farmers to grow what they wish. That seems pretty natural. Replace energy subsidies with targeted cash transfers. Replace the untargeted energy subsidies with targeted cash transfers, but ensure that cash transfers reach the poor. Make teachers and schools accountable for learning outcomes, not just enrollment. And I didn't talk about that, but I think we need to allow private universities too. We can discuss that in the Q&A. And the final thing is separate foreign borrowing decisions from foreign policy. And I want to end by saying, you know, these ideas didn't come from me. They were also in the Aragalaya movement. Here was this beautiful poster in the Aragalaya movement. People should not be afraid of their government. Governments should be afraid of their people. That's the accountability. They got it right.